Welcome. We're so glad that you're with us for this webinar this morning or this afternoon, depending on where you may be. My name is Greg Forster. I am the director of the Oikonomia Network. The Oikonomia Network is a network of theological faculty and friends and their schools dedicated to whole life discipleship, vocation, fruitful work, economic wisdom, serving the common good. You can find out more about us at our website, oikonomianetwork.org. And there are lots of great opportunities that we hope you'll check out. A quick reminder, I'd just like to remind you to mute your Zoom when you are not speaking so that we can control ambient noise. By tradition, we have stopped saying mute yourself. Instead, we say mute your Zoom to respect your human dignity. But we do ask that you mute your Zoom to control that ambient noise, and we're grateful to you for that. I will be sharing at the end of the webinar a few other opportunities we have in the Oikonomia Network that we hope you'll find fruitful. And I will, about midway through the webinar, I will post in the chat some links to contributions that our three featured speakers have already made on this subject, so that if you are looking for more, you can check those out. So watch the chat for those links later in the webinar. For right now, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague and fellow troublemaker in the Oikonomia Network, Donald Guthrie, who is a professor of education here at Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. Donald's going to facilitate our time together today. So Donald, take it away.
Great, thanks, Greg. Entrepreneurship and theological education. Entrepreneurship and theological education? Seems like just a few years ago, they would have been strange bedfellows to discuss, but not anymore. In fact, they need each other very much. Perhaps theological schools are uniquely equipped even to bless our communities by helping students develop biblically informed approaches to entrepreneurship. We hope our discussion today moves us all toward that end. We're really excited to have Charisse Jones, Dean Blevins, and Oye Waddell with us today to talk about this important topic and timely topic. Charisse runs something called Grace and Grit, an organization that empowers women in entrepreneurship. Dean's a longtime leader in this whole conversation in theological education, connects with entrepreneurs through the Ministerial Entrepreneurship Initiative at Nazarene Theological Seminary. And Oye helps foster entrepreneurship in underserved urban communities through Hustle Phoenix, as well as working with Arizona State University on entrepreneurship education for students. Thank you guys so much for joining us. I'm just going to jump right in to the first question. And maybe, Charisse, I'll ask you to respond first, okay? What are the biggest changes happening, big picture here, biggest changes happening in culture and the economy right now that are bringing entrepreneurship to the forefront as something that theological education needs to include in its curriculum? Charisse, why don't you start us off?
Wow, what a great question, Donald. And good morning or good afternoon to some, and welcome. And thank you for taking time out to join us for this important conversation. That's such a great question because I think everyone here knows what 2020 represented. 2020 was the global shakeup of the economy. We had the global pandemic that affected the marketplace, jobs, the workplace. It really was a point, not just nationally, but again, globally, of a total disruption. And if you have an entrepreneurial spirit or entrepreneur mind, or if you're an entrepreneur yourself, that in times of great disruption, entrepreneurship tends to rise to the top, because we see all kinds of needs happening where others might not have the foresight or the sight to see amidst all of the chaos and confusion that may be happening. But entrepreneurs have a specific type of sight and mind to think about what are the problems that we're seeing happening in the economy due to the global disruption, such as what happened in 2020 that's continuing to disrupt in many ways to this day. But there's a special kind of sight that arises within the entrepreneur that sees the problem, but also tries to figure out the solutions. So when we talk about what's happening in culture, I want to point to that as something very significant. If I could just share briefly, I was checking in with several of my pastor friends about what was happening in 2020. How were their congregations handling this type of disruption? And a lot of pastors and leaders kind of confessed that it kind of hit them by surprise. They had to pivot in ways that they didn't expect, that they were unsure about. So they were on shaky ground and shaky footing. So when we talk about preparation of our students in our seminaries or other Christian academic institutions, it's knowing how to navigate times of disruption is a big thing for me, and how to lead effectively when disruption happens, how to capitalize on issues or problems or concerns that we may see in culture and the economy, and how to harness the power of creativity through the Holy Spirit in order to provide solutions to those needs.
Great, thank you, Charisse, for starting us off. Dean, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, and I would just agree with Charisse. I mean, I think probably the sort of the Sunday school answer for right now is COVID and its impact. Probably one thing that happened is up until that point, I suspect a lot of places, ministry and entrepreneurship was seen as sort of a boutique, hipster kind of vision of what that might look like. And then suddenly every congregation was faced with innovation and disruptive change. And this became a language of need as opposed to a language of option. And a lot of different denominations and adjudicatories, so that suddenly thinking and being innovative and asking for leadership to move less from a sort of administrative perspective to a kind of leadership that requires innovation, it was just thrust upon churches in ways that were not anticipated up until that point. And so now it's like, how do you begin to navigate it? And I think those who have I'll call it an entrepreneurial spirit, were clearly the kind of leaders that were right out in front. Suddenly they were the creatives that were demonstrating that, not necessarily because they were part of large congregations, they just knew how to pivot. And I think that has signaled a broader need moving forward. So I'll leave it within that. Probably the only other thing that I'll mention is since 2020 was also about the American Census and the work of PRRI and sort of really naming the shifts in demographics here in the United States, including white evangelicalism, that people are recognizing business is no longer as usual, that there are going to be ways in which communities of faith are going to have to rethink themselves in light of longer trajectories that are going to call for much more complex partnerships down the road. So I'll stop with that and let Oye get into the mix too.
That's great, thanks. Go ahead, Oye.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add, I think in terms of when you think about this global pandemic, and not just the pandemic in and of itself, I think how we move forward beyond the pandemic, especially when we think about theological education, entrepreneurship, I think we need to all have an entrepreneurial spirit in terms of how we think about church, how we think about gathering, and then how we think about doing business. And I think most businesses that I know that have been impacted, because that's what we do, our work is we work directly with businesses. Typically, we serve about 120 plus businesses a year. And so we've been in the trenches with a lot of these businesses and helping people think. And then also, obviously, my role as a pastor. And one of the things that just amongst pastors that I'm seeing is that we are all rethinking how we gather. And so we have to be we have to not only do it differently, but we have to be cognizant of all of the things that are going on around us. And so how we gather, how we do business when we think. And I think we can't live in a silo anymore in regards to, hey, how we gather, how we do business. Those are different. I think there's a lot of similarities, and we can unpack it as we go along in this talk, but I just want to bring that up.
Great, thank you. I'm thinking now a little bit more directing us toward the role of theological schools in particular. If you could address some things that you think that people like the presidents of our theological schools, the deans, the board members, faculty members, what do they need to be thinking about, in addition to what you guys have already said, but what do they need to be thinking about this particular role that seminaries can play, given what you've already described as such amazing changes and opportunities? Dean, let's start with you.
Yeah, as if any president would want to hear from a faculty member on this, right, before it's all said and done. But I do think one of the things I would say that the schools have to recognize, there's a kind of language, if you will, that says once we get back to church after the pandemic, and I'd say this, with the disruption we've seen, there's no going back. So what are the skill sets? What are the things that will be needed for ministry moving forward that really will be a part and parcel of the way in which the communities of faith, the church, respond? And how do we start creating open space for those to emerge? And instead of saying, we have the answer, and therefore these are the things that need to happen, how do we create that space for that entrepreneurial spirit to kind of begin to manifest itself within theological education? Here at NTS, just a case in point, when we started ministerial entrepreneurship, we thought it would be a program alongside a degree inside a seminary. And over the last 5 years, well, the program has changed, and we have been in conversations about the adaptation of the entire life at the seminary. So in a way, it becomes a lever, if you will, for other institutional changes. And it's not a widget that you can just add from that standpoint. And I would say for leaders in theological education, once you start this, you have to really be adaptive in allowing these kinds of innovations to shape the culture of the institution rather than just be seen as an add-on.
Yeah, thanks. Oye, you have some thoughts about this one directed towards the...
I do. Can you restate the question really quick, just so I can make sure I answer very pointedly?
Sure. We're thinking about presidents, deans, board members, faculty members. What do they need to be thinking about as they take up this question, given the disruptions and the opportunity?
Yes, I think one of the things that I think we should rethink is how we do theological education on campuses right now. I think instead of, I think we should be creative in how we actually deliver the education. For example, I was a part of a program called Missional Training Center through Covenant Seminary, where Covenant brought the university in a home in Tempe, in Tempe, Arizona, where pastors, over 60 pastors throughout the city, would come and receive education theologically throughout the week, right? And so it was just a different model. It was a hybrid model where it wasn't just fully online, but professors would fly in to Phoenix and teach in a home where pastors don't have to leave their daily, pastors don't have to leave their post, if you will, or their congregations to receive theological education. And so I think that's one way, I think, just to think creatively about how we do theological education, not just in a university setting, but it could be in different places, right? We could bring it to where the pastors and the leaders are. I think also, in addition to it, when I used to work for ASU, one of the things that was very important was that entrepreneurial thinking was implemented in every discipline, right? And so entrepreneurship wasn't just for entrepreneurship. So when I think about theological education, I think entrepreneurial thinking should be taught in counseling. It should be taught in pastoral ministry. It should be taught in be taught in how we do missions. It shouldn't just be, hey, entrepreneurship is almost siloed or separated. It should be integrated in everything that we teach. It's because all of us have been impacted, and we all have to think differently about how we actually do ministry in our everyday work.
Great, thanks. Charisse, anything to add there?
Wow, Oye, you were in my brain on a couple of those things. In terms of opportunities that seminaries have, one of them was the delivery of courses in theological education, and the other one was the integration of entrepreneurial thinking. My former role prior to launching my company was at Asbury Theological Seminary as co-director of the Office of Faith Work and Economics. And so we immediately understood the importance of faith work integration in the seminary setting. I want to take that a step further, that seminary education around entrepreneurship, faith and work, the work being a diversity of work. When we say calling, it's not limited to the four walls of a church. Calling is very diverse and it's very wide. And in terms of even scripturally, the way we think about calling, Jesus spent most of his time outside of the synagogue, amongst the people, in the marketplace, in communities, talking. And so when we think about that in that particular context and preparation of our students, it's thinking about the larger meaning of calling and purpose for our students. Some of our students that enter into theological education are not going to be exclusively pastors. I'm ordained clergy, I'm a deacon in the Methodist tradition. So my role focuses on bridging the gap between the church and the world, which is really equipping believers to understand their shaping, how God has molded them, and where those gifts and skill sets are best needed. So seminary has to expand the language of what we mean by calling and to be called, and not exclusively to the church setting, but also to business, also to the arts, the creative arts, entertainment, to movies. It encompasses a lot because we need Christians in all of those spaces in order to be salt and light in the world. So I want to talk about, because I used to hear a lot often, okay, now I'm in seminary, and people tend to forget their work, their work, and how that work and those experiences actually fold into their new experience in academia. In terms of, I want to agree also with Oye, in terms of delivery of theological education, the expansion due to the pandemic and the disruption of education and not being able to be in a physical space, we saw the market for e-courses and these digital companies like Kajabi and others really rise to the forefront of people who were creating content around skills and education that was needed. So we saw different platforms use that brilliantly. And so it would be a great thing for seminaries to really think deeply into and be innovative when it comes to delivering education. Sometimes people don't need to get a MDiv, you know, sometimes they don't even need to get a master's level, but can they tap into your online platform, hear from your professors, hear from other Christian marketplace leaders, business leaders, and entrepreneurs that are working in partnership or collaboration with your institution to deliver real life practical skills and tools that folks can use that are everyday to apply to their workplaces, to apply as entrepreneurs to their business. And so we think about e-courses. I'm glad you mentioned counseling as well, Oye. I spoke to our counseling students about, you know, the app that was created, you know, to get your counseling through that platform. And some of the students weren't familiar with an app, but one student said that they were interested in creating a podcast. And I was like, yes, that's what we need, that kind of thinking across our degree programs. And also to think about how to do dual degrees that may have an MBA combined with an MDiv, or maybe a degree that's focused on marketplace, or a degree that's combined with public policy. So even the way that our degree programs are structured can be more innovative and can tap into the individual students' passions and where they see their trajectory in terms of their vocation going. I've got more, but I don't want to take up, but I'll say this: innovation labs. We need places and spaces within institutions and churches where we can percolate ideas. Begin with prayer. God, there are needs that I see in the community, economic needs, people without jobs, homeless, people who are trying to find work, or people who have great ideas and need to tap into. So innovation labs at our institutions, maybe you don't create one, maybe you partner with one in your city, and they become a place where students can think about ministry creatively. They don't have to own a business, but they can surely think about how can our church serve the needs of our community. So innovation labs within our churches where people can have the space to be creative and to ideate and to work with business mentors and business coaches to further develop those ideas that will be useful to reaching people for the kingdom.
That's great, thank you. Let me just say to folks who are joining us, if you have a question you'd like to have these guys address, put that in the chat. Depending on how many we'll have, we'll get to a few at least pretty soon. I have a few more, but then I'll look to the rest of you for your questions in the chat. Let's think about students for a minute. What about students who don't foresee this kind of work in their future? I just came to seminary to learn how to preach the gospel and love people well and serve the community, whatever I'm trying to do. And entrepreneurship, that doesn't sound like stuff we should learn, or it doesn't even make sense to me. How can we talk to our students? You guys have said, each of you have said something about kind of bleeding this all the way through the curriculum so that perhaps they can't help but encounter it. But I'm thinking more about how to persuade them, how to show them that this could be part of pretty much everybody's education. Dean, go ahead.
Okay. Well, I want to be mindful. I think I can say out of experience, I've had a few of those students who actually show up in my class and they're like, wait, is this what we're supposed to, you're asking me to think about starting a venture. Why am I being asked to do this? And so there's a kind of awkwardness at that point. It's almost like, can I transfer classes? And I just stress, think innovatively. As much as we talk about entrepreneurs, there is this language of intrapreneurship, this ability to be adaptive from within an organization. Actually, it's actually been some of the testimonies of those self-same students that's helped me in talking to future students, where there is resistance even in the moment of the class. But I mean, part of teaching, I don't know if this is a good way to say it while we're being recorded, but it's a bit of a gamble. I mean, we don't always know how students will use the information. And what I find is that they are surprised sometimes how these principles just infiltrate across the life of the church. And so I think as long as students understand that entrepreneurship and innovation, and I'll invoke one other one, design thinking, and that version of innovation is pluriform. I mean, it doesn't have to work just in one area. They begin to grasp this, I think, a lot faster than we realize. I'm going to be careful, though, to say, and this is the flip side of it, there are times where particularly good entrepreneurship education is also helpful for the student who may have an imagination, but not necessarily understand the fullness of the risks that are involved. And so for them, if that kind of education helps them know where they fit within ministry, it's not a bad thing. And particularly, I was listening to Oye's TED Talk about helping walk an entrepreneur through the various levels of where their strengths are. Entrepreneurship education isn't always saying everyone can be equally creative. It's really knowing where you are and what your skill sets and strengths are, and then building on those. And I think that's just good ministry discernment from that standpoint.
Yeah, thanks. Charisse, how about students?
I'm going to quote Dr. Brian Bogus, who defines entrepreneurship in this vein that probably would help ignite a little bit of a fire in our students. He says that entrepreneurship is a creative act made possible by the creative impulse that God gave us. He describes the entrepreneurial process not being an entrepreneur, but an entrepreneurial process as looking at the world and seeing an unmet need, an area of dissatisfaction, or a problem, and then to visualize a solution, often a solution that requires a completely different approach, something no one else could see. So when we think about entrepreneurial thinking or innovative thinking, it can translate very easily to a seminary student when we think about needs of the world, because why are we the church? Why are we called? We're called to be salt and light in the world and to use what God has given us in terms of our gifting, in terms of our skill sets, in order to address those needs, to present the gospel in those ways that they can flow through. So I think with framing entrepreneurial thinking and the process in that way, in terms of if you're a pastor serving a church and you're inside of a community, looking at the community, walking your community, seeing what those needs are, praying with your leadership team, praying with your church, and then inviting God into that process of saying, okay, God, what can we do? How would you use us? And what gifts and skills do the people possess in order to make those things happen? So I think entrepreneurship is a great way to join in the missional work of God. It's not so much, I think it's products and services, but it's also a spiritual type of commodity that we are transacting when we have Christians who are business owners or thinking entrepreneurially, because we can deliver our work in our workplace in such a way, we can deliver our products and goods, our products and services through our businesses in such a way that's very distinctive. And so that also can be a spiritual type of experience for many, when it comes with regard to that. So I think framing the conversation that way for our students will help in kind of teasing out that the work matters. It's not just work inside the church, but it's our work collectively as believers, as a church in the world.
Thanks. Oye, I noticed in your TED Talk that you had a pretty significant emphasis on mentoring and coaching. And I was going to ask you first, but the others can jump in to that importance of that role as we talk to, particularly we're thinking about students in our context. Can you tell us a little bit more about the role that the mentors and the coaches who come alongside play and perhaps could play in the lives of our students?
Yes. I'll start off with this. The difference between wealth and poverty is relationships. I say that every time I talk because it's so true. When you think about, let's just think about spiritual formation. Let's think about your role as a professor, your role as a student, whatever you are in your life. I think the people that you're connected to are usually the people that get you to where you're supposed to be. It's just divine, right? And so mentorship is so important in this conversation, whether it be entrepreneurship, whether it be pastoral ministry, whether you're going on a mission field, wherever you are, mentorship is so important because it essentially helps people. We always use the example of we sometimes as individuals, whether we're starting a venture or leading a team, sometimes we don't have eyes to see. And our mentors who have been before us, they've been there, they've done it, and they can see what we're about to encounter or embody. And a lot of times the mentors are able to help us guide us and move us. And so in the context of the work that we do with Hustle, we support entrepreneurs in urban inner city communities, right? And so entrepreneurs who have shown that they have grown, they want to grow their businesses, they receive a team. And on that team is a banker, somebody in sales, marketing, operations, risk management, and a personal mentor. And that team acts as they pray for them, so they minister to them, but they also act as their advocate. And so they're out in the community telling people about that entrepreneur's business and also providing support to their business and their specific expertise. And so one of the things we tell our mentors is like, hey, we want you to go on an urban mission trip. We want you to use the giftings and skills that God is giving you to serve urban inner city entrepreneurs. And so our key verse is Genesis 12:1-3, where God blesses Abraham and says, you're blessed to be a blessing, right? And so God has blessed us with skills, abilities, whether it be, particular in our case, if you're a lawyer, a banker, somebody in sales, marketing, you're a business owner, God has given you those skills. And what are you doing with that to be a blessing to the poor, right? Or the marginalized? Well, we give people a perfect opportunity. Let's use this gifting and skills that God has given you to be a blessing to these entrepreneurs in the city. And so I see that with students. If you think about seminary students, students that are going into pastoral ministry, creating a mentorship relationship actually helps them go further. Because that, again, like I said in the beginning, that mentor has been where they're trying to go. And so that mentor can provide support and help them move forward. One last thing I'll say, and one of the things in the last question, you talked about sometimes seminary students struggle with entrepreneurship. And I would say this, everybody's not an entrepreneur. And I think in our culture today, entrepreneurs is such a big topic. Everybody, hey, start a business, start a business. Everybody's not an entrepreneur. And I think we need to recognize that. Entrepreneurs need people to work for them. Everybody needs a job. And so that's nothing wrong with that. So I think we need to acknowledge that. But I think one of the things we need to understand is that everybody's not an entrepreneur, but everybody can think like an entrepreneur. Because again, no longer do employers, whether it be in ministry or when you're on the mission field, wherever, no longer do we just press buttons. We need to think creatively about everything that we do because the world is changing rapidly. And so I just wanted to thank you.
Yeah, can I piggyback on that for a second? Just briefly. The Kauffman Foundation, which is located in Kansas City, does a lot of very intentional research on the field of entrepreneurship. So they generate a lot of white papers. They work with national surveys and studies. And they have a kind of emphasis here more on what they call an ecosystem around the entrepreneur. Their kind of talking point is out of 1,000 people, only 3 will probably be flourishing entrepreneurs. But you need the other 997 people to kind of support them to provide the fullness of an ecosystem so that they actually can flourish over time. And I think that's a helpful way for the church to even think about how they fit within a broader scheme of bringing about change, both for mentorships and actually even at times being the incubator spaces without necessarily forcing everyone into a particular framework. It's a kind of an oxymoron to say we're going to make everyone an entrepreneur. But I do think this idea of fostering innovation that's a part of the entrepreneurship's mindset is something that can be a part of the church.
That's very helpful. Charisse, you have anything to add? Particularly, I was struck by Oye's comment that mentors are advocates. That's very strong summary there. Do you have anything to add about that or anything else about mentoring?
Right. That struck me as well. Both of their comments. I mean, we're just so in tune, but in my business for Grace and Grit, I do life coaching and leadership coaching, and really it's transformation and mindset coaching, all of it wrapped up into one. But that mentor coach is such an important role. And even, in my time in the academic space at seminary, working with students, the question was coming to my office from many students, I'm in this degree program, but I see myself using it differently and not in so much a traditional way. And I need, to talk through some ideas that are, that I'm having or percolating. And so the person that's the mentor or the coach for the student becomes a very pivotal role because that individual helps to listen, but not only listen, but to probe with questions that allow the student to really think about, okay, with these questions that you're asking, okay, let me dig a little bit deeper, let me pray a little bit more, and let me find out that special shaping. And I can't tell you how many students that I've sat down personally with as they've gone through their degree programs or have made a change in their degree program because they felt God's leading them in a particular direction. So, in my business and working with women and I have other students who are male students, and then people who are in professional and workplaces or beginning to start their businesses, as well as entrepreneurs, coaching becomes a very key aspect because there are goals and dreams and things that people want to get to, but they need the guidance in that. So the mentor and or the coach provides that particular support for the person. So it's so key in the relationship, and to really underscore also what Dean was saying about the ecosystem or the ecosystem. I serve on 2 nonprofit boards that are faith-based or Christian-based, and both of those boards are not entities unto themselves, but there's an ecosystem of churches, businesses, government, and individuals and other people within the community that are supportive in the work and the goals and the mission of that organization. And it's a beautiful thing to see all of the giftings and skill sets from everywhere, from believers come together around a mission or missions within a particular community. So that's the importance of this entrepreneurial kind of thinking, not being an entrepreneur per se, just as we've stated before, but entrepreneurial thinking, new ways of working together so that we can bring the kingdom of God, or bring more heaven here on earth.
Great, thank you. I think that answers somewhat, Meredith, thank you for your question about how to encourage and equip students to think innovatively. I would say whether or not they're entrepreneurs or not, to the points you guys have been making. Everybody's in on this one, of course. I wonder if you could think for a second about what you most wish graduates coming out of theological schools, how they could be equipped as frontline folk equippers, as advocates themselves, people in positions in the community to encourage everything actually we've been talking about. Can you say a little bit more about what you'd hope for our students would come out of our schools knowing and being and doing?
I think for me, and this is just a basic, and I'll use the language posture that comes, actually it was a kind of a shock to me. It comes in and through the work of design thinking, but there's a lot of language of should or ought or must that is, I think, a part, and for good reason, a part of theological education. I mean, stances that we want to make that we think are very important. But sometimes instead of saying should or ought or must, the language of how might we, I think, is one of the most important kind of posture shifts, where you still carry your vision, but you acknowledge that there are constraints. I mean, there are challenges, but then you don't give up in the midst of that. You don't constantly push against systems, but you begin to think innovatively, how might we work from within this to bring about change, as opposed to it's got to change. And working with a lot of theological students as they graduate, where they've been steeped within a particular kind of culture, if you will, helping them to recognize as they move into settings, whether it's in a church or whether it's independently, to be able to kind of work from within the constraints and still bring about change, I think is one of those really, really important kinds of shifts of thinking that I do think entrepreneurship and design thinking both bring to this conversation. It's you no longer languish with them being locked within a fixed way of thinking about how to approach something.
Great, thank you. Charisse or Oye, do you have anything to add there about what your hopes would be? And
I would say one thing. The question I think theological students should ask as they leave is, as they go into culture and live into this world, or what are the idols of our day? And how do I think creatively about pressing against those idols? Because you gotta, I think that's simple as that. And I think we have to think entrepreneurially about how we press against the idols of our culture. And if we don't, we will lose the battle. So what are the idols of our day? And how do we think entrepreneurially and creatively on how to impact those idols?
Very, very good. Thank you. Charisse?
That's good. That's good. I would really hope for students leaving seminary to have a really good level of understanding on how to leverage the gifts around you. A lot of times the weight of leaders, pastors, and others is I've got to do it myself. Or if I don't know how to do it, then I'm not effective. When in actuality, the church as a body with its diversity of gifts is meant to work in tandem and collaboratively, in a very interconnected way. So when it comes to mission and accomplishing the purposes that God is calling us to, whatever the context or the space may be, how do I rest in the confidence of my strengths, and then how do I call forth and encourage others in their strengths and giftings so that we can all work together? And I think that's a good strength of a leader, to be able to know that you can't do it by yourself. It's impossible. It's impossible for a pastor or one single person to carry the weight of everything that needs to be done. So to get very, very comfortable as a leader in recognizing that and being able to encourage and support the giftings of others and skill sets so that we can accomplish good work.
Thanks. Kevin, thanks for your question. He's asking, why are women so underrepresented in entrepreneurship within the church and so marginalized within the church? Any thoughts about that? Maybe Charisse, why don't you at least start there, since empowering the women that you're working with is so much a central part of Grace and Grit.
That's such a good question. Thank you, Kevin. I would say that, well, let's not start with some positive. If you Google the largest segment of female entrepreneurs, you will find that Black women are at the top of that chain in terms of starting businesses. And so, women of color often leave spaces, leave workplaces because of not being valued or presented their worth. And so they go on to start businesses. I would say that's probably a good portion of me starting my business, among other factors, in 2020. However, I understand your question. And I think with culture, and this goes back to, we won't call it gender wars, but it's recognizing that we're all made in the image of God. And as a people of God, we've got to see, or we have to see that men and women, we're different in gender, but in terms of God calling us to specific purpose, God calling us and gifting us and equipping us with certain skills, that is how we ought to move forward. The opportunities, as you know, in terms of funding women entrepreneurs and people of color, is far less in terms of gaining capital. And I would love for Oye to chime into this, because he's doing wonderful, awesome work in diverting some of those challenges. However, there's great challenges in our culture just with regard to the way women are viewed as leaders and as people contributing in worthwhile ways in the marketplace. And so there's not one answer, but there's a lot of underlying things that happen in our culture and then happen within the church in terms of the way that we view women, even leaders in the church, women leaders in the church. So those are just, it's a multi-layer conversation. However, I'm here and Oye's here and others of us are here on this call to change that narrative and to present opportunities to provide support for women and also people of color in entrepreneurial spaces, for them to be able to come to the forefront and to flourish. So I don't have a single answer, because it's a multi-layered conversation in history, that goes way, way back. However, I think what we're focused on and what I want to focus on today is just being able to, how do we, and I think Oye said this at the beginning, how do we make the way forward? How do we become more innovative? And we're seeing a lot of that happen with women, venture capital to the forefront to fund other women. We're seeing companies that are venture capitalists, companies of color that are focusing on Brown and Black communities. And so there are ways for us to remain faithful in the call as people of God to overcome those barriers and challenges by presenting and being innovative and creative and creating space for us to contribute.
Thanks so much, Charisse. Good word.
Kevin, really quick.
Yeah,
I
sure.
just want to say, just Kevin, that question, I would say, thanks for asking it, but it's I think it's, I would say the folks, it really depends on the tradition that you're a part of. And I would say because in the African-American church, I think, and even the communities we serve and a lot of the churches that we serve, there are a ton of women starting businesses and doing amazing, right? And so, but when I worked in a predominantly white evangelical church for 9 years as a pastor, and I do remember these type of questions coming up. And so I really think about it's a part of what tradition or where you're from. And I think it impacts that question. But in terms of in predominantly Latino and African American communities, you see tons of women starting businesses and doing it extremely well. I see it every day, so that's why.
Mm-hmm. That's a good word. I kind of want to underscore that because women and people of color have always, I want to say this very carefully, but we've had to be creative and innovative because we've been locked out of spaces.
Yeah,
instinctively taps in. So saying that carefully, but it's just, it's kind of like that old saying, we make something out of nothing, right? We are able to pivot. We're able to be nimble. Okay, that door is closed. So I'm just going to build a door and I'm going to walk through the door and then I'm going to bring other people through the door with me. So I agree wholeheartedly. And that's why we see, that number for female entrepreneurs, for Black female entrepreneurs is skyrocketing or at that top of the list because of things like that.
and I would just say, as a white male, but in a denomination that validates women's call to ministry, we still don't tell those stories well. So they're there. We just haven't preserved those. It's the images that we choose to preserve that creates that problem.
Thanks so much. Entrepreneurship and theological education. Thank you, Charisse and Dean and Oye. I'm going to throw it back to Greg. I just want to point out just quickly, if you're interested in helping Scott out, see that in the chat there, Scott. Contact him directly. You can see his email there. Back to you, Greg.
All right, thank you. And very, very grateful for this rich, insightful discussion. I want to quickly invite everyone to our big annual event, Karam Forum, where these issues will be further developed, and we'll be looking at many more contexts. With Chris Brooks, pastor from Detroit, talking about reviving reconciliation as a general framework for thinking about how the church can work for justice and mercy in society today. We've got David French and Michael Ware talking about the challenge of the church seeking justice in the contemporary world. A whole bunch of colleagues talking about justice in church history and how Christians have worked for justice in the past, plus opportunities to connect and collaborate with all the amazing people in our community. We're so blessed to have you, and you're blessed to connect with each other, and we love to facilitate that. So there's a link in the chat for our Karam Forum event. It's November 18 and 19, and you can join us live in Fort Worth, or you can join us by Zoom from wherever you are. So check that out, learn more, look at we've got a schedule, we've got a bunch of information about hotels and stuff, and register today to join us. So thanks very much for being with us. We look forward to future opportunities. If you want to stay in touch, we have a monthly newsletter, and you can go to our website at oikonomianetwork.org, and right there on the front page, sign up for free. And get our newsletter and stay in touch with everything we're doing. So please stay in touch yourselves, and we look forward to hearing from you, and we'll see you next time. Thanks for being with us.